Good evening, and welcome to the sixth episode of Voices. I am quite audible, yes? It's wonderful. This sixth episode of Voices features artist Sumakshi Singh in conversation with arts writer curator Priya Pall. Voices is curated by Serendip Art and the Hashtag Collective, of which I'm a founder member as a year-long archival art initiative. Let us look for a moment at the notion of the archive, which has been an important meta idea right from those first conversations with Ravi, when Voices was emerging as a concept. Wouldn't you agree that it is extraordinarily important not to forget, and that there simply isn't enough archival interest or material about the modern and the contemporary moments of Indian art? We need to capture our histories not as the accounts of victors, but as the voices of a variety of people like you and me, currently living through extraordinary times. This was brought home recently in certain lateral ways. When I was researching Chicken Run, my fictive archival art project for the Chennai Photo Biennale, or when Sumakshi shared the loss of her laptop and the loss of content. We believe the voice of the artist is part of our history. In the uncertain landscapes of a rapidly changing world, it is important to keep track of these voices and for it to be easily available, not just to future writers and researchers, but to the artists themselves. Arthur C. Clarke was talking about keeping records of scientific data when he called such archiving the real treasure of mankind, more valuable than all the gold locked uselessly away in bank vaults. But I believe it holds true for the creative landscape as well. Well, that's our hope by curating a series such as this, where artists share their practices and ideas within frameworks teased out by the arts writers and curators. Voices, we believe, is an important South Indian-based platform to archive artistic happenings of the creative present. To briefly introduce ourselves, Bangalore-based Ravi Kavle is a former industrialist, art collector, and gallerist. The other partner of Voices is the Hashtag Collective. Now, Ravi set up Serendip Art as a gallery by appointment to showcase contemporary Indian artworks. He is deeply interested in supporting the larger environment in which the arts are created in India. He has sponsored the Ananya Drishya program and is a curator with the Alliance Française de Bengaluru for Young Talents program. Now, as to the Hashtag Collective, it was formed by Biju Kuriakose, Abin Chaudhary, Sarah Biju, and myself. We each have strong individual practices as artists and architects, but come together to explore multi-disciplinary artworks, site-specific installations, and initiatives such as Voices to create greater engagements for the public with art and the issues of our time. Before I ask Ravi to introduce tonight's speakers, a quick word about meeting hygiene. We would be delighted if you would post your questions and whom they are directed to in the Zoom chat box or the YouTube platforms, or as always, you can message me or Namrata directly. After the main session, Sumakshi and Priya will try and answer as many questions as they can. Over to you now, Ravi.
Thank you so much, Parvati. Happy New Year, everyone. And hopefully we shall drive all the forms of COVID away soon. That's a fervent hope for everyone. We are very happy and proud to present Sumakshi Singh, artist and educator. She has a BFA from the MS University, Baroda in 2001 and an MFA from the Art Institute of Chicago in 2003. She has taught, mentored, lectured at the School of Art Institute, Chicago, Oxford University, UK, the NGMA Delhi, and for the Victoria and Albert Museum. Her installations, illusion mappings, animations, paintings, threadwork, and sculpture have been exhibited in group and solo presentations at Saatchi Gallery, London, Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, C24 Gallery, New York. I mean, the list is endless. There's so many locations. She is the first Indian artist to be commissioned by ERM for their artist windows and is the recipient of several grants and awards, including YFLO, the FICCI, and ZEGNA, Illinois Arts Council, Richard H. Dryhouse. Singh's immersive installations are an invitation into a slower rhythm of time. So I hope you will really enjoy today's talk with Sumakshi. Coming to Priya Pall, she has a career which spans over 25 years, and she specializes in the field of museum management and planning. She has been the founding executive director of Bikaner House, New Delhi, 2015 to 2020, and director Saath Saath Arts, 2019-2020. She is on several advisory boards, including Hyundai Motor India Foundation and NDTV's Special Art Projects Division, Moharto. From 2011 to 2014, Priya was responsible for setting up the Heritage Transport Museum, Manesar. In addition to an MA in Museum Studies from the National Museum Institute, New Delhi, she has studied art history from Sotheby's Institute, London. She is an alumnus of Lady Shri Ram College and has an advanced diploma in the French language. So I now leave the screen to our two illustrious, presenters today. So we take this forward from there. Thank you.
Good evening, friends. Thank you, Ravi, so much for a wonderful introduction, and to Parvati for introducing Voices and exactly what you're doing. I think it's a fabulous initiative, and I really wish that there were more of us who would take such initiatives. Wishing you all a happy new year as well. And I truly, truly do wish that we see an end to the pandemic. Today, I'm extremely pleased to be in conversation with Sumakshi Singh. I've known Sumakshi now for over 12 years. I first met her in 2008 when she had just moved back from the acclaimed Art Institute of Chicago and was mentoring a residency at a gallery called Religer Art Gallery. Unfortunately, that gallery doesn't exist today. Since then, I followed her works from India Art Fair to Kochi Biennale to several private gallery shows, and lately an installation at the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art. And the latest one being the Asia Art Pacific Triennale. And through all of these various exhibitions, I've seen her practice grow in many different ways. I'm hoping that the conversation with her today will allow you insights into her thought process that informs her practice, and that you would then be able to experience her works in a completely different manner. How does Sumakshi speak about her practice, and where does she situate herself? So I quote Sumakshi. For me, making art has been a way to look at where I am within myself and in the world, to process life and to process the big questions about death, in grief, beauty, and joy, to look at what feels real and how can I go about recognizing it. It lets me observe how meaning is constructed in the multi-layered experiences of existence, all these sort of meaty territories that aren't always, or perhaps almost never, satisfied with a mental answer. Well, let's see how we understand Sumakshi's works as she takes us through her own journey today. Please join me in welcoming Sumakshi Singh as we begin the session tonight. Welcome, Sumakshi.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Voices. Thank you, Ravi, Parvati, everybody. Lovely to be here.
Let's begin.
Shall we start? Yeah.
Sure. So tonight, what I've done is I've structured our conversation on 5 terms, so to speak: sight, time, embody, illusion, and space. and see how these terms manifest in Sumakshi's works of art. The first section of our talk is to do with sight. I thought I would start by asking about how your practice has been particularly responsive to sites or environments. Many of your earlier works distinctly rely on the site where they're experienced, but the way you treat a site is quite different. I've heard you often speak of what we're conditioned to see and what we overlook, and how we give ourselves permission to see something. What do you mean by this? And how does this lead you to create these micro environments and micro interventions in a space?
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start sharing my screen so I can share some images as I answer Priya's question. So please let me know, can you guys see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, perfect. So Priya, to answer your question, I've used sight in many different ways in my different bodies of work. So sight has shown up as the subject matter of some of my paintings. I have worked with the history and the physicality of sight. So like playing with the architecture of a space or creating artwork that specifically references the history and events that took place on that site. As you mentioned, I've worked with our conditioned ideas around certain sites, for example, gallery spaces. So for example, one might experience, a pair of shoes on a pedestal in a gallery a little bit differently than they would experience that same pair of shoes lying in their house. And so what is it about that site and our conditioning that gives us permission to view it in a different way. And over the years, I think my art explorations have gone from exploring sight as gross physical place to the subtler spaces, like spaces of memory and imagination and the spaces that inhabit us. And often sight for me is actually a way to address and perceive space itself, like the space between things and behind things and inside things, until their very sort of thingness starts coming into question. So I'll start with this really early work, which is like back in 2001, and I had moved then from Baroda to Chicago. And what I'm showing you here is basically a really common sight that I would see in Baroda all the time, which is like trees growing out of the sides of buildings, and this very like casual, organic interaction of architecture and nature. And from here, I moved to this, which is Chicago, and downtown Chicago, which is, arguably one of the most manicured parts of the world. And it was one of the first times I'd sort of seen the landscape, almost be converted into another form of architecture. And it was a landscape of like these boxed categories, and manicured, manipulated nature always maintained at its best. And it was a landscape of sort of human control over nature. So all the trees were sort of the same height. You never saw weeds in the sidewalk. And the epitome of it was these tulips where, after a long Chicago winter, which goes on for months and months, and you don't see a leaf on a tree or a bud, you suddenly wake up one morning and the entire city is totally flooded with these fully bloomed tulips, and you never saw them grow.
And they almost look like they're photoshopped into the space.
They look like that in real life too. And 2 weeks later, it's like they've all magically disappeared in the middle of the night and you never saw them die. And so to me, it was really quite odd, to take this sort of complex and nuanced natural cycle of like birth, growth, death, decay, etc., and isolate just this one part and present it for human consumption. And it seemed to be like placing value, like solely on that climactic moment. And the rest of it, it was okay to sort of bypass that journey to achieve this sort of immediate gratification. So I think something in me wanted to complicate this edited story and also to start to maybe like pervert the sterility of these perfect surfaces. And so the work I was actually doing in Chicago at the time looked like these, these tiny sculptures made out of polymer clay and aluminum. They're always just a couple of inches big at the most. And they started to look more and more like organic activity, like mushrooms or fungus or something that could naturally grow off a wall instead of something that had been placed on it. And because of the scale of this work, people would often come into my studio and ask me questions like, oh, those two tiny holes in the wall on the bottom left, are they part of your work? And I started getting quite interested in how, the architecture, which was normally invisible when you're looking at the artwork, was actually becoming activated because of the scale. And so I started intervening directly into the architecture and seeing how I could make the walls sort of bubble up or crack, or this is like a detail of the floor in one of the gallery where it just sort of looks like these little cracks. And you can see that the language of these micro interventions really starts to look like weeds in a sidewalk, or, that part of nature which hasn't yet been maybe pre-processed or packaged for human consumption. And almost none of these micro interventions were ever sort of placed at eye level. So, they would be along the periphery of the room or in the corner. So as you'd start to walk into a space, it would basically look almost like an empty room or something that was lightly scarred or recently deinstalled. And as viewers would start to approach it, these micro interventions would start to reveal themselves. This is a piece called Urban Fungus, and it's just about, like an inch and a half big, and it weaves in and out of the wall. And it's polymer clay and Vaseline, and there's nails and fungus and moss, etc. And I've painted the shadows of those copper wires and painted that pink reflection under that mushroom form, etc. So this question of how much is natural, how much is constructed starts to come up. And when you look through this, actually, you see like this diorama behind it, which is almost like this red pocket with papaya seeds that start to sprout during the course of the show. But it's not really a contained pocket of activity, because as you back up from it, actually what you see is this, which is, more holes on the wall, and then you see some moss. And then when you back up, you see more. And when you back up, you see more, until essentially like all the walls, the floor, the ceiling seem to become these really saturated, proliferating membranes. And the viewing of them is almost like seeing a series of things in your peripheral vision and letting it add up to something. Did you want to ask?
Yes, I wanted to, so if you walked into a space, somebody said, okay, I'm giving you this white cube kind of a space, would you walk around and see if there were already some cracks that you could work in? Or was it a mix of some which already existed and then some you created?
Yeah, so a bit of both, actually. So there were, in fact, I'll talk about that in just 2 slides from now. So I will, here, 2 slides away. So basically, when I walk into a space, I, first start to play by placing some of my sculptures, and then often use the natural textures of the wall or natural cracks and start to sort of amplify them. So if I see a tiny crack, often I'll put layers and layers and layers of paint on it and then cut into it further, so it sort of exaggerates what's already there. But other times it's completely constructed and it's like an artificial history of the space that's being created. So there's both going on. And what starts to happen with using this architecture as well is that I guess all these pieces start to like migrate into each other's territories. So it becomes very hard to say where a piece actually ends or begins. So when my photographer would come in to take photos, like his question to me was always like, okay, how do I photograph this? Is it just this pink piece, or is it that with the scratch? Or is it that with the 2 holes? And And in a sense, the pieces are almost like decoys because people spend as much time looking at the walls between the pieces as they do at pieces themselves. And so what was actually the background starts to become the figure, and what was the invisible on display, like you were asking. Also, what's interesting about your question is that no matter how obsessive I've been about like making every lump, bump, crack, mark whole, there's obviously tons in the space that I haven't done. And viewers walking in are sort of often confronted with this question of how much is pre-existing, how much is accidental, how much is amplified, how much is artistic intervention. In other words, how much is the art and how much isn't. And this is a question that I think each viewer hits up against or perhaps releases the boundaries of, in their own mind, whether seeing that crack is going to be, part of that art viewing experience. And often when they give it permission to be part of that art viewing experience, I find that it's hard to turn it off when you leave the gallery after paying that kind of micro attention.
Right.
So I get, calls from people saying there's fungus here on the wall in the subway stop in a hole. Is this your artwork? I saw this crack with the weed. So I saw how the gallery as a site could also start to serve as a sort of highlighter tool that was perhaps highlighting what was already present, but not always visible. And people could take that to their own environments, to start to reevaluate them.
Right. So actually, that's it's very interesting. That brings me to the next question, especially where you're talking about somebody who sees mold in the corner of a street and then calls you and wants to know, is this actually an art intervention or is it growing by itself? Because it also brings up this notion of time. So how does that work in your work? This is now the second part of my talk with my question to you. I find it interesting how time is embedded in your work and how you bring about the relationship between time passing and its effects. And I remember particularly this one work, I think, this is the one where there's a leak in the ceiling and you turn that into an artwork by capturing how that leak in the ceiling made a mark on the floor over a period of time. And then again, it's interesting that with you're once again making an attempt to capture something as fleeting as time. And I would be interested to learn how you view time. What was the motivation behind such a work?
Yeah, so I think time, like space, time is something that permeates almost all my different bodies of work. And I guess that's not surprising because space and time are so deeply connected. I mean, it's space that actually holds time in a way. And in my more recent work that we'll maybe see towards the end of this conversation, I've been looking at time as rhythms that we carry within our own body. I've been looking at time as pause and time as dissolution. But this earlier work, which I'll share a few projects here, I think time shows up in these projects as memory and as remnants. And in some of them, it shows up as a displaced moment. And in others, it shows up as an extended moment. And so, this was one of my first solo shows that I did in Chicago in 2003. And at this point, I was thinking a lot about the site of the gallery. And in particular, the idea of a gallery space, which is that it's a neutral white cube, to witness some kind of cultural or intellectual activity. And then its physical reality as a space, which is that it's a space saturated with its own physical qualities and hence, in a way, the impossibility of ever being neutral. And I wanted to play with both these perceptions of the space. And to do so, I decided to start by highlighting all the pre-existing flaws that were physically present in the space, so as to subvert the neutrality of the idea of the gallery. So I walked around the gallery and, worked on a bunch of floors. And then I was delighted to find that there was actually a leak in the ceiling. And so I unscrewed the pipes and exaggerated the leak and removed the ceiling tiles, and then built this sort of ramp with a central tide pool, which was, 2 layers of plexiglass and resin, with thousands of these polymer clay sculptures underneath, that essentially, as it would be raining outside, that pipe would, continue to leak and that tide pool would fill up. And as it was sunny outside, the water would start to evaporate, leaving these concentric traces behind, and this sort of marker of time. And I'd also painted these water damage stains, in different parts of the gallery to kind of echo this primary intervention. So the first one was an amplification, and then these are sort of fiction in a way.
Right.
So time also comes up as I was saying earlier, like creating these sort of artificial histories of spaces. And this was a project I did in Zurich several years later, where essentially I took layers and layers and layers of colored paper which I'd actually painted, and then stuck them together and then started to carve and cut into them to resemble like these peeling walls that were, falling apart. And the show also had these tiny micro interventions. And when you finally round the corner and enter this room, it looks like the space has almost exploded, because, the walls are basically peeling till they look like they're in full bloom.
So Sumakshi, what in the previous slide, what one is seeing is actually the painted paper that you had pasted on the walls and then peeled the paper to show the layers.
That's right. So if you go close to this, basically, this is what it looks like. It's layers and layers and layers of paper, which have actually been cut and carved and folded to look like the wall is peeling. And the back of the paper is sort of greenish, like a kind of mold, and it creates this green reflection on the wall. And then these were other iterations of it. This was at the Maxi Museum in Rome, where I created this barrel vaulted ceiling and played with these art historical characters. And I think I'm just going to skip this one, because I think we might run out of time, because I want to get to this. So in 2006, I was invited to do a public art project in New York. And what I ended up doing for it was I traced out all the holes in the sidewalk down Houston Street. And I created these paintings that were basically acrylic on canvas, and fitted them into these holes and cast them under layers and layers of resin. So they actually just looked like these puddles of water. And as viewers would be walking down the road, like on a perfectly sunny day, seeing these puddles was sort of like that element of curiosity that, drew them to look within. And what they'd see there was basically these reflections, which were completely accurate in perspective and also accurate in space, but not actually accurate in time. So, for example, like the trees that you see in the reflection on the left are there actually around this puddle, except that now it's summer and they have foliage. And this is an image of the trees as they look like in winter. And on the upper right is the underside of an umbrella of a fruit cart vendor from Mexico that used to live on the street but had gotten deported. And on the bottom right is the reflection of a building that used to exist there 50 years ago, but no longer exists. So as viewers basically walk down the road, they see these puddles almost as these little sort of space-time hiccups, giving them, access to the histories of things that have occurred there. And simultaneously, I was on residency in the Catskill Mountains while I was making the puddle-based pieces. And this is a project called Average Utopia, which also deals with time in a different way. So I'd been reading The Little Prince, and in that book, he talks about how his planet is so small that anytime he wants to see the sunset, basically he just has to shift his chair and then he can see it. And one day he saw the sunset 44 times. And I was very charmed by this idea of this eternal sunset and the poetry of it. But also I was thinking about this idea of immediate gratification and the tulips and being able to have that climactic moment whenever you want it without having to wait for it. And what does it do to desire, like if you separate it from time? And
so the sunset is not just something that you see at the end of the day.
Right.
You can see it any time of your choosing.
That's right. That's right. So what does that feel like then? And so I created this piece, this huge piece. It was like 38 feet or so out of fiberglass and resin. And then I painted it to look like the reflection of an impressionist sunset on water. And then I rode around the lake with my sunset attached to me. And then at the end of the day, I basically installed that sunset reflection in the lake so that morning, noon, or night, whenever you wanted it, you had, the sunset on demand available. And the idea was actually to make it out of colored ice eventually, which didn't work out for a few different reasons, because I finally did want that sunset to start to melt.
Okay. Well, thank you. Okay, so I have titled the third section of the talk as Embody. In certain works, such as especially Mapping the Memory Mandala, which is also one of my favorite works, it's almost as though you're trying to embody or inhabit a memory of, that's in your mind. And in this particular case, a memory of your grandparents' living room. And I'm quite intrigued with a series of works that you've made where it seems as though you're trying to map the action of the eye in a physical space by mapping the action of the eye in our minds, what we see in our minds, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. And there's also an attempt perhaps to reconcile something intangible, such as fragments of one's memory or the subconscious, with something highly tangible, such as the fact of the architecture, where there's a physical space. So it's interesting how you try and bring the two together. And if you could speak perhaps about mapping the mandala, mapping the
memory mandala.
Memory mandala.
Yes, sure. Yeah, so, all this working with the puddles and the perspective, I think it made me very aware of just how unstable our perceptions are. And just moving my head 1 inch and that image is completely different. And I started to notice just everyday objects in my studio, ladders, stools, etc. And, just start to notice how my vision was working and how the eye actually sees things. And I did a series of experiments with trying to map these 3-dimensional objects. And that eventually led to this project in France in 2008 called Mapping the Memory Mandala. So we grew up as a nuclear family, my father, mother, brother, and me, moving all over the country. He had a transferable job, and so we lived everywhere for 2-3 years. So our sense of home was actually always tied to my grandparents' house, which was 33 Link Road in Delhi. And year after year, we'd come back to this house. And I think like most people's grandparents' houses, nothing much ever changed in this house. Things were sort of very comfortingly frozen in time. The Hajmola was always in the top drawer, and the same paintings were always in the same place in the living room. And we'd spent a lot of time in this living room, which is what you're seeing an image of over here. And so we knew the story behind all these objects that, basically my grandfather had spent a lifetime collecting. And some of them were from trips to Czechoslovakia, and some of them were bets that he'd had with Maharajas. And so there were always these amazing stories behind these things. And after he passed away in 2006, I remember walking through this living room and looking at the space that he'd occupied. And it was a very uncanny feeling because although I knew all these things so well, my knowledge of what they were and the way I was currently perceiving them was no longer matching up. Right. And so there was this, I felt like I had to renegotiate my relationship to all these once familiar objects. And I wanted to, digest that gap between my knowledge and perception. And as a way of doing that, I basically drew out the illusion of his living room on all the pre-existing objects in my studio in France. So basically, from the vantage point of the entrance, it looks like his living room is right there, but it's actually drawn in chalk pastel on a chair, on a trash can, on a canvas, on a shutter, on a jar, on the floor, on a shelf, etc. Right? And as viewers would walk through the entrance and leave that vantage point, the whole image would start to skew and sort of stubbornly retain this now inaccurate perspective. And it was almost, like your vision got stuck in one point in space and time, and suddenly you were free to divorce yourself from your vision and walk into that abstract map of your own vision from another vantage point. And the physical objects start to then reveal themselves, the chairs, the tables, etc. And as people would enter this rather disorienting world where things were fracturing and skewing, they would simultaneously see themselves on screen in a large projection. And on screen, they were actually in the lined up illusion of my grandfather's living room. So in a way, that mediated version on screen was a more graspable reality than the direct perception, of that space. And I saw how, bodies really started to slow down as people were negotiating being in two spaces at the same time, and what the implications of a gesture in this space would have, in that particular space.
Right.
And when you asked me about embodiment earlier, I felt, and I'll show you the process and things later as well.
Well, not to hurry you along so much, but is it possible for you to show us the process and then
Yes.
take us through what you felt about embodiment simultaneously?
Perfect. So let's do that. So essentially, the process. So the process is basically, there is a camera at the entrance, and then I have made a drawing of my grandfather's living room on a sheet of glass. So the camera looks through that drawing into the room behind where I'm running around. Now I can see what the camera is seeing because I've connected that camera to a projector.
Mm-hmm.
So through the projection, I can see myself through the eye of the camera. And then I'm running around in 3D space trying to trace out a two-dimensional drawing of my grandparents' living room that doesn't actually necessarily correspond to where I'm standing in space and time. So I'm going to show you a little video of it, which should hopefully make it clearer. And I should also just say that, the reason it was called Mapping the Memory Mandala was that the idea was that as people would start to come in and move through that space, these objects would start to blur and finally erase, letting me sort of say goodbye to that fixed memory of my grandfather's living room.
Right.
So
as transient as a mandala.
As transient as a mandala, meant to be erased. Yeah. So this is basically what I'm looking at in the projection.
Right.
And I'm in physical space trying to make my drawing on the ground and on the trash can line up to that drawing on the glass.
Right.
Sorry. And then this crazy shape lines up finally to look like a chair.
Mm-hmm.
And bit by bit by bit, sorry, I'm not sure why I did that. Yeah. And bit by bit, all these, physical objects start to get obliterated by the drawing. Yeah,
when you Sorry. Well, I think we get a fair idea.
Yeah.
Although I'm curious that when you began recreating your grandparents' living room,
Yeah.
did you do it out of memory? Did you use a photograph to help you with it? Or was it just what you remembered and then you created it and then compared it with a photograph or what it actually was?
Yeah. So in this particular case, I used a photograph. In some of the later work that will come up, the thread work, etc.,
Right.
that was actually interesting because there's a story about memory in that, where I made the pieces from memory, and then I went back to the house to measure the pieces and found out my memory was completely inaccurate. And then when I made the newer pieces, even after they were made, somehow the pieces I'd made from memory seemed a lot more real to me than the ones that were technically accurate. Yeah.
Well, actually, this process, yes, surely there's a sense of illusion which arises from this, where you're also denying perspective. You're flattening a 3D image, and then you're inviting a viewer to become a part of that field. And so creating this illusory space and a physical engagement with it. And so I believe that embody and illusion are then linked. And I thought maybe at this stage it might be appropriate to then move on to your threadworks, because that is where embody and illusion come together. And can you share with us the genesis of the threadworks and how they came about?
Okay. So I'm going to go past all of this. The Kochi Biennale. Sorry. Okay. So the thread work. So this work sort of started a few years ago. My mother, she passed away in 2013, and she was a highly accomplished embroiderer and also an incredible gardener. And in all the different homes we lived in, she managed to create these really magical, spectacular gardens that made everyone after us want to move into our home when we were leaving. And as a way of sort of reconnecting with her, I started to trace out the words from letters that she'd written to me while I was living in Chicago. And I started to embroider these words. And as I was, halfway done through the embroidery, I started to realize that the reason I was embroidering them was it felt much more permanent as a mark than compared to a drawing. Like I couldn't just erase an embroidery. The image was literally tied to the ground, right? And I wanted to somehow fix her words. And ironically, as I was done, as I had finished sort of embroidering that letter, it felt like, her words were almost protesting being stuck like that. And they didn't like that. And so I started actually cutting the fabric out, and that didn't work. And then I tried it on transparent fabric, and that didn't work. And finally, I invited her embroiderer who'd worked with her for many years to come work with me in the studio. And he recommended this material, which was actually soluble. It's a soluble fabric. And he said, why don't we try embroidering on this? And so that's what we did. We embroidered her words out onto this structure, right, and then finally just dissolved the structure away, leaving these words sort of levitating almost, like this imprint. And they seemed to be happy with that. And shortly after that, we basically started to embroider all these different plant forms from her garden that she'd often press and preserve and, send in her letters to me. So it started to become like this skeletal archive of, personal memory of the garden. And some of these pieces are also embedded in plaster and wood to look more like fossils. And this was shown in a show at Exhibit 320 called In the Garden. And there were two aspects to this show. And one was, the memory of the garden, like I just talked about. But the second was the experience of this living garden. And there were two sets of gardens I was thinking about here as well. And one was my mother's gardens. And the second was the garden of this Swiss hermit who'd lived in the Himalayas as a sadhu for like 62 years. And I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time in this garden with him, where it felt like I had walked through a portal, and the light and the radiance of the trees and the plants were different. And so this garden is more an homage to his particular garden of light. And this installation is done, this is all stop motion animation. So as I was embroidering the image of one plant, I would take hundreds of photos and then run them in a sequence. So every plant that appears has either been painted or embroidered, and thousands of these images have been stitched together to create this.
Beautiful.
So this is all on the website. Okay. And this was another piece in the show that again had to do with that garden of light, which was, these are 3 silk panels with a Shinwazari style embroidery, and this stop motion animation is projected on it that shows how it was created, and it starts to illuminate different parts of the tapestry, and the birds start to fly and move, in between these panels.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
And this one, the blueprint of before and after, is that also an installation that one immerses oneself into?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so at this point, basically the garden becomes an immersive space. And this was a show that I did in Israel. And I really wanted to create this, the garden almost as this weightless, almost like a mirage, something really ethereal. And my hope was to create, this space of real silence and slowness. And the name, the blueprint of before and after, was basically that this was a garden that was, either we were looking at like the blueprint of this garden in the ether, and it was about to manifest and it hadn't yet taken form. Or perhaps, this is the aftermath of a garden that once existed, and we're essentially just looking at, the ghost of this particular garden. Yeah.
Great. Now that brings me to the final part, and the final term that I chose was space. Now, what do I mean by this? I think perhaps what I meant is the space in between time and memory and illusion, if they were to come together. I find that in your work, there's a kind of a sublime energy in the space. There's the shadow, the index or the trace where the critical mass is removed. And I find this very intriguing, and perhaps the perfect way to describe works that you've made during the pandemic. So I'm asking you, was there a different energy that you felt during these last 2 years, which gave a new impetus to your practice?
Yes, I do think the last 2 years have been quite different. And well, thank you for that lovely comment. That's a lot to think about also. What I'm going to do is maybe tell you a little bit about this particular project, which is essentially based, and this was pre-pandemic. And then from that, maybe I'll move into, how it switched during the pandemic, and also talk a bit about, space. So I think what almost all my bodies of work have in common is that they all seem to be about, they all seem to sort of articulate a space or a world that maybe hasn't yet fully crystallized or solidified. Things are sort of in a more liquid, flexible state. And the conditioning that sort of creates the polarities where one decides whether something is going to become an object or it's going to become negative space, or it's going to be past or it's going to be future, or it's going to be art or it's not going to be art. That hasn't yet quite set in. So it's sort of more in this like fluid pool of potential energy, which is, just like shimmering a bit like a mirage on that veil between manifest and unmanifest. So they often tend to be extremely insubstantial and deal with transience, in a real way. And transience, so to come to transience and memory, in this project. So this is called 33 Link Road, which is again the address of my grandparents' house, where they built this home shortly after the partition of India, when they moved from Pakistan to Delhi as refugees. And this has been the family home for over 70 years. And of course, the site of numerous gatherings. It was listed as our permanent address. And for the first time in 70 years now, this house is actually empty with, both my grandparents deceased. And I wanted to process this feeling of when something solid and hard and sheltering becomes almost, ethereal and fragile, like a memory, like a spectral cobweb in a way.
Right.
And so I went into the house and I actually measured, every chitkani, every bolt, every door, every window, etc. And recreated them life-size in thread, which also one of my most common memories of being in this house was embroidering and knitting with my grandmother in the sun in winter. And so I wanted to convert these stiff surfaces into something soft and tactile and, almost feminine. And so this, yeah.
Okay. So I think we probably have 3 minutes before we need to take on questions from people, and I can already see many people posing questions to you.
So we don't get to the pandemic work then today.
Well, maybe if,
which is fine.
How about the video?
This one of the dissolution, or the other, that fern
The
piece?
fern, yes. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the title of that work.
It's called On Time and Its Witness.
Right. I think it might be a nice work to end with, and then we'll be ready to take questions.
Sure. So what I'd like to, I think these last 2 years, there's been a lot of, no, I can't say it in 2 minutes. I'll just show you the piece. So
I guess you can take a little longer.
Yeah, could I kind of intervene and say, actually,
Please.
one of the questions, Sumakshi and Priya, is to do with creating art during the pandemic. So, this could be an answer to that question as well.
Well,
then.
Yeah.
I will take your question, kind person, and go back a few slides then. Yeah, so the pandemic, I feel like we're at this really unique moment in human history where, I feel like we're sort of on this unstable cusp of like a shifting world rhythm in a way. And many of our old systems and structures seem to be like in this process of, unraveling or shape-shifting or mutating. Our social systems from all this isolation, our economic systems our political systems are polarized, the environment is mutating. And also this pause caused by the pandemic in the usual frenzied sort of pace of the Anthropocene, I think has been an opportunity for many of us to relook at our relationship to time. There's this Irish poet, John O'Donoghue, that talks about different rhythms of time that we carry inside us. And I agree with this, I feel this, where there is this sort of more surface rhythm of time, which is very much by the calendar and structured and deadline based and can be frantic and future oriented. And then there's this other rhythm of time that emerges from inside when you're just spending so much time by yourself, alone, working at your own rhythm, or you're walking in nature, or you're perhaps embroidering. And so I think a lot of the work that I created during the pandemic really does sort of work with this idea of unraveling and mutation and shape shifting and collapse. I've started to embroider the shadows. So now it's actually going the other way around, where the insubstantial is being given substance.
Right.
And again, the unraveling of these structures. And then a series of these animations that basically look at time as, dissolution, but also different rhythms of time. So I think I will actually skip this particular project and show you the one that we were talking about. So this was a project, this was a show in Dubai last month. And the show was sort of based around the idea of the Anthropocene and light and shadow. And what I've done in this particular work is that there is a white fern and a black fern. And this white fern is sort of 8 feet tall, and it's like a specter. It's like the silent witness that stays unmoving on the wall. And it faces like the black fern, which is in the middle of the floor, sort of like its shadow or its counterpart. And the black fern, actually this shadow, I'm just going to speed this up because it's like a 20-minute video. The shadow slowly starts to grow out of the, the base of the black fern, and it starts to skew and it starts to rotate around it. In the manner of a shadow created on a sundial. So it's like a very, very slow natural rhythm as it starts to, move around it. And after it sort of finishes one rotation, it's like joined by the second shadow and the second movement, which starts to move in a much more mechanical way, like a clock. And over time, a second and a third and a fourth movement start to join it. And each movement going a little bit faster than the one before. And they start to overtake each other and overlap. And finally, they start to go faster and faster and faster until they kind of blur and eventually disappear, leaving behind only that sort of original, natural, that slow rhythm of time that starts to then get sucked back into that navel that the black fern comes out of. So yeah, that's my On Time and Its Witness.
Thank you, Sumakshi. I have to say that, taking a concept, then registering that work and developing it, the entire process is nothing short of brilliant. And thank you so much today for sharing with us so much of your practice, your thought process, as well as the process of making the work. Parvati, I think we're happy to open the floor to any questions.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful. That really was wonderful. And I have to share a comment before I start on the questions, which is Lena saying, it's beautiful and incredible to hear an artist say, I was delighted to find a leak in the gallery. So I think that really deserved to be shared. Well, the question about working in the creative field during COVID, what were the anecdotes and challenges, actually is addressed to both Sumakshi and Priya. Priya, is there anything you want to add to how it was to be a curator in these times? And then I'll go to the next question to Sumakshi.
Yes, I'll have to say that it was difficult, and especially because I've spent the last about 7 years of my life in museum planning and, not exhibition planning or curation per se, but institution planning, and that's just changed completely. And something that Sumakshi also brought up, that how our institutions are being viewed, they're all shifting and nothing seems to be on a firm ground. So yes, it's been particularly tough. And it's interesting to see also how everything's now moved to a hybrid model. there's an offline and an on-site version of literally everything that we're doing. So one has to now adapt, one has to reassess one's skills and see how does one adapt to this new situation. And that's where I'm at.
Thank you, Priya. The next question is addressed to Sumakshi by Darshana Bajaj. And I think she wants to know, what is the place of art the way we see it in museums, that is sculptures and paintings which exist, in terms of hundreds of years, whereas you look at time in a very different way. What do you think the role of that is?
I think that's a question for Priya, actually, more than me. She's the museum lady.
Well, I think the museums, again, they also have to change. And if artists, museums have to be platforms that encourage artists to be as creative as possible. So now, you can't just look at works which were of a particular kind, but make the platform such that they welcome all kinds of artistic practice.
But I'm going to still ask you, Sumakshi, do you feel there was a certain riff in the work that you do, especially the ones that are more, time-bound and insubstantial, as opposed to the more conventional notions of art as, lasting for sort of, as Darshana says, hundreds of centuries?
Longer, I'm not clear.
I think it's about your work being ephemeral, which is in contrast to the way that art has been perceived in the past.
Yeah, so my feeling about art is that I think we engage with art in an extremely limited capacity in our current in its current state. It's often viewed as a luxury item, a collector's thing, something aesthetic, or perhaps an intellectual commentary, or something that has a little, resonance with culture at that moment. But I think if we go way back in art history, art has been used for, it's been used as a shamanic tradition, it's been used as healing, it's been used as, in fact, the health of a society, even a creative practice, right brain modes of thinking. So, I don't know, I've just never been particularly concerned with the longevity of the work as much, although I have to say the thread pieces, for example, I mean, they're nylon fiber. It's one of the strongest synthetic fibers that exists. But I've actually been more interested in that ephemeral quality of the work, where it's, it's done and it disappears and it leaves a certain, maybe an invisible vibration in the air. I don't know. So
if you don't mind, I'd like to actually turn this question on to you, Parvati, especially with Voices, where you're building archives of artistic practice. So how do you see art, which is temporary, or it's just there for the moment? How do you see archiving artistic practices such as that, such as Sumakshi, for example?
No, I think that, archival processes and thinking about it becomes even ever more important when it comes to ephemeral art.
Right.
We briefly discussed, there is a question of saying, what do you keep and what do you not keep? I mean, you do need a certain intellectual rigor in deciding what you can keep, because, I mean, we all live in information and visual information overload. But I think, to archive processes, to archive thoughts. I mean, what you and Sumakshi, for example, are saying today at this point, with this cloud of the third wave and so on hanging over us, you will forget, hopefully, in a couple of years. For example, I'd forgotten, I'd sort of written a short story that got picked up about how, the initial impact of COVID was. And when I read it, I think, really, were we so surprised? Were we so taken aback? What was it? So I think archival is a process of recording work processes as well as ideas and thoughts. And I think that's where we hope voices will come into to preserve what you and Sumakshi are saying now, what you think now, and to see how this riffs against something you might say or think in the future. So, yeah.
Right.
A question to Sumakshi, and I think we could take one or two more. There is a comment saying, "Bravo, Sumakshi, thoughtful and personal. Thank you." And another one saying to Sumakshi, saying, "Do you think you will return to previous styles? That is, you will return to things like pastel drawing and playing with perspective, for example, or is thread and lace a place you will stay in for a while?"
It's highly unlikely. I haven't really stayed in a place for a very long time, so chances are things will move. But I should say, so, the presentation of work I've shown today are just a few little snippets from different bodies of work. There's a lot of other stuff going on. And so the painting and drawing, for example, is a practice that I rely on heavily, and that's going on all the time. And that's actually like my baseline for a lot of this other illusion-based stuff, lace-based stuff, all of this that happens. The painting and drawing always continues. I have a few ideas actually about the illusion-based work that I want to do with thread, which involves creating these environments that start to dissolve, and also maybe working with a group of dancers to choreograph the creation of the illusion of architectural structures using thread, which then only again work from that vantage point and to play with that. So there's a few ideas about sort of mixing these bodies back and forth, but also some ideas for some other material and projects. So let's see what happens. But I don't feel done with thread yet, if that's your question. I don't, and I'm surprised because it's been I think 5 years now, which is fairly long for me to stick to one medium. not like you, Parvati. You've got your that diligence and that perseverance, and find the new in the old, and that's also
but I sort of jump as well, from
with animation,
drawing to animation to video to film, and I think it's nice to think of it as a toolbox and or a palette, and you pick the one that suits you at the given time. There is a question, and maybe we'll take this. Well, I'll take the comment from Lena first, which says, along with the shift in perceptions of time, there is also often an engagement with fantasy, storytelling, and dreamlike experience that comes with the presentation of the work, even though it mimics organic reality. I particularly remember leaving the terrestrial. So I think that's just a comment that Lena would like to share with you. There was another question asking what the lace is made of and how long it takes you to make a work. So you've already told us about the lace. Do you want to address time in a very literal sense there?
I'm not really sure how long it takes, because if I'm working on maybe a piece like this large, that could, just in terms of physical work time, as long as my idea is all sorted and I'm on it, that might take like maybe 3-4 days to physically just finish that much. But when I'm working with, large scale installations like my grandmother's house and some of the other things which I haven't shown, those took about like 1.5 years or so to make. Because also the process of dissolving them is not that simple, because the way they are embroidered, it has to, once the structure dissolves, what is left behind has to be strong enough to create its own structure and not upon itself. Plus, when we're dissolving it, that they all have to be sandwiched between layers of fabric, so they don't just collapse and become a ball. They have to be stretched. So there's a lot of intermediate steps in this process that are also time consuming. So about 1.5 years or so. Yeah.
Right. Well, I sort of think we're coming to the end of our time. I'm going to invite Ravi to make any observations and comments that he wants. And I'm going to ask both of you after that to make your final closing remarks, thoughts, things you wanted to say but were never asked.
Thank you.
Ravi?
Yeah, thanks, Parvati. Thanks to Sumakshi and Priya for this wonderful web of fantasy that they've woven around us this evening. I think, you kind of literally taken all the paintings off the walls and taken them on a walk through our galleries, and so this walk through time and space, and for me it has been kind of a great revelation, and very, very philosophical thoughts, especially in these difficult times, and how we are dealing with the physicality of things, and everything is becoming virtual, so very kind of the kind of questions like being and nothingness and void and object, and it's all been a great way of putting things, and for giving us a different way of looking at things. I mean, to perceive in a very different way. So thank you so much, and I think we will also continue these talks through the first half of the new year. We're looking at that, and we really appreciate that so many people have sat and patiently listened to these talks. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I'm going to ask if Sumakshi and Priya have any closing remarks they would like to share.
Well, Sumakshi, you go first.
I just want to say thank you to all of you, and a big thank you especially to Priya, because it's just been such fun having this conversation, and also some of our earlier conversations. I think she's offered me a lot of new insight into my work as well. And that's, I think, the value of platforms like this, especially when we're sort of isolated in our studio, making our work during a pandemic, to sort of really have the pressure put on you to really connect and have an in-depth conversation. So it's really been quite wonderful for me to come out of my shell and do this with Priya. And thank you, Priya.
Well,
Especially.
likewise, it's really been absolutely amazing, and I've loved delving into Sumakshi's works. And Parvati, for the last few months, has been telling me, Priya, why don't you curate? Why don't you curate? And I've been telling her, no, I'm more into institution planning. I think I'm going to stick to that. But it's been a beautiful way to begin the year, and I've absolutely loved doing this talk, having various conversations with Sumakshi. In fact, when we first began, I think we could have easily made this talk to be about 2 hours long, and then we had to edit and edit and edit. So what you saw today was just a snippet of Sumakshi's works and her artistic practice. And I really hope that everyone today did get an insight into her work and will go back now and look at her practice in a different way. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sumakshi and Priya. It's been a special pleasure to welcome you both here today as old friends and whose practices I know. I have to say, Priya, it was really insightful the way you constructed such interesting lenses like sight and embodiment through which to see the work. And your idea of the notion of embodiment and illusion is something that I will take away. It was very special. And Sumakshi, what a rare treat to get this inner glimpse, into the creative process, to hear about unstable perceptions, the permanence of embroidery, the dissolution of fabric, the manifest and the unmanifest. Bravo, it was wonderful. So from all of us at Voices, Ravi, Namrita, Sarah, Bin, Biju, and myself, a quick shout out to each and every one of you in the audience as well. We appreciate that you've taken the time to listen to such discussions. And we thank you for working with us and taking small baby steps towards creating an arts environment based on creative generosity and intellectual rigor. Voices will return with episode 7 in February. Do tune in. Until then, stay safe and keep the conversation going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.